a go. Hello, everyone, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the first episode for the month of May. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Many of you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us is a first timer making her official debut here on the show. She's a freelance writer, editor, and journalist. She enjoys hiking, attending poetry slams, and going to Swedish metal concerts. She reads an excessive number of books at once and enjoys a diverse range of genres from poetry to nonfiction. However, her true love lies in fantasy and myths. Since she was 6, she has known she's wanted to be a writer. And she specializes in fiction editing as well, with expertise in fantasy, horror, and anthology development. She believes that good editing should be invisible. And without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, writer and editor, Beth Carlberg. Beth, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Awesome, Beth. So before we dive into your background as a writer as well as an editor, is there anything further you'd like to add about your bio, anything that wasn't covered for our viewers and listeners?
Just a distinction. So my pen name, I write under Beth Carlberg, but my editorial name is Beth Eiler. I just like to separate those out. So if anybody is looking for me, look for me as a writer under one and as an editor under another.
Absolutely, absolutely. And curious, Beth, as a writer, do you have any books you are working on that you like to share with our viewers and listeners, even if they are still works in progress?
So I'm currently querying my first novel. I'm editing 2 more and then writing 3 more because why have one project? My first novel that I'm querying right now is a dark fantasy novel with sapphic undertones.
Ooh.
And my 2-sentence blurb about that is, for Anna, the most powerful of her kind in generations, magic is not beautiful. It's brutal and exacts a debilitating physical toll.
Ooh, nice. Very, very nice.
Thank
Honestly,
you.
I love that. I can't wait to. I know you don't want to give too many spoilers because it's still in the process, but
Yeah.
that's a perfect little teaser, a little window at what we can expect. So, before we dive deep into your passion for writing, as well as how you also started your career as an editor, let's talk a little bit more about you, Beth. So, from your bio, you've always had this passion for reading. You loved reading. And as it said, you read an excessive amount of books, which honestly is a person after my own heart because I love reading as well. You can't see it, but I'm surrounded by like 2 corners of books, which is just, it's a lot, but honestly, it's a nice thing to have. So, how did this passion for reading come about that then translated over to writing your own stories and then helping others, what's the word I'm thinking of, further refine their skills as fellow writers?
So I have a very distinct memory of when I was like 4 or 5. My cousin and I were writing a picture book together. And I was asking my aunt at the time what somebody that wrote books was called because I didn't know what the word was. Figured out took a little back and forth with her till she figured out that I meant that I wanted to know what a writer or an author was called. And ever since then I was like, oh, that's what I want to do. To get a little into detail with my background, I actually struggled with reading as a child. I did not read at my grade level until I was like 10 or 11. But my mom was always encouraging me, always reading to me. I was surrounded by family members who were constantly reading. And so even though it took me a while to catch up, I guess, on the skill
Right.
level, I was always surrounded by it. And as a teenager, I was reading a ton of fantasy, a ton of mythology. I was reading, Robin McKinley, Mercedes Lack. Oh, I'm mispronouncing her name. And a bunch of other fantasy writers from the 80s and 90s and that really cemented my love for the genre. At the time, I was absolutely obsessed with like fairy tale retellings
Okay.
and kind of discovering the non-Disneyfied version of fairy tales, which if you know anything about fairy tales, you know that they're not kid friendly.
No,
Or
they're not.
at least not kid friendly for modern sensibilities. Let's put
Yes.
it that way. So that kind of tipped me into like the dark fantasy arena. I do write some urban fantasy. I'm trying my hand at romantasy. Still unsure how that's going to go, but I definitely tip more toward the horror side of fantasy. And then from there, in college, I was a journalism major, and I figured out I really liked editing. I actually liked editing more than I liked writing the newspaper articles themselves.
Okay.
And then I have been writing, freelancing on and off while having another career, unrelated to writing for a very long time. And then in the last 2 or 3 years, things have changed where I'm editing and writing full time. Not making a ton of money off of it, to be honest, but making some. And currently getting my master's degree from Western Colorado University. They have a publishing program that I highly, highly, highly recommend. And then I'm getting a second master's in genre fiction. So I'm kind of getting 2 masters, one for the business side of writing and one for the creative side.
Fascinating. All right. That's actually really cool. And I've actually never heard about that. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, because I'll definitely make sure to link that so our viewers can check that out, because yeah, you're absolutely right. To be like both a writer and an editor, to create one's business, it's not easy. It's a lot of work and a lot
Mhm.
of dedication. So let's actually talk about that aspect for both sides, both aspects of you, the writer and an editor. So, for the writer side of you, when you're working on a project, what are your goals as well as promises you're making, not just to yourself as the author, but also to your prospective readers? And is that in a way different from how you work with a fellow writer as an editor?
Yeah, yes, very different. So, I actually, it's very hard for me to write on the computer because most of my editing is done on the computer. So I actually handwrite everything, first draft. I transcribe it, and then there's a transcription software that you can read it to it, and then it'll transcribe it for you.
Okay.
And so I use that because it kind of short circuits the editing part of my brain that you really don't want turned on when you're writing that first draft, because it just gets in the way of, because you can't edit something that's not complete.
Right.
I know some people that edit as they write, but I feel like that stalls the novel, because you keep seeing all these things, and I feel like until you get to the ending, until you've told yourself the whole story, you don't know what you need to edit yourself to. And so that first draft for me is, because I am a pantser, so I have loose plot lines, I have major plot, I have like 2 or 3 major plot lines,
Right.
but I don't necessarily know how we're getting there. And sometimes those plot points change because of what the characters do. And I like writing that way because it feels genuine to me. It feels like the character is driving the story. And so sometimes there are things that surprise me. And so we have to work our way to a different conclusion sometimes.
Absolutely.
But I want readers to feel like the world is real, especially in a fantasy setting. I really want them to feel like the magic is just ingrained in the people and the culture, and it's as real as gravity, essentially.
Right.
And I really want, especially for dark fantasy, a lot of my dark fantasy centers around magic not being this wonderful, amazing thing. It centers around magic is painful. It's debilitating. It has physical tolls on people. Like I like that idea of magic being this powerful thing, but it can be quite costly.
Right.
And a lot of my magic systems kind of orient around that basic concept. And so I'd say overall, I want to give the readers a very visceral experience that deals with a lot of heavy emotions. I don't intentionally put those emotions in the work. They just sort of come out.
Right.
And then there's other books, like my urban fantasy novel that I'm currently editing is a little more lighthearted. It's got some weird and quirky stuff in it. And so I like to throw that in there and try to balance out that serious and that the serious with the funny. So I guess the promise I make to readers varies based on the work. But either way, I want it to be an immersive experience. I want the characters to be feel like living, breathing people. And I know a lot of writers say that, but I genuinely do think that, especially in fantasy, you really want realistic characters that people really genuinely care about.
Absolutely, 100%. And I like how, this mentality kind of transfers over to both, that in your own personal writings, you want your characters to, as you say, you want them to be believable. You want them to exist in that world that, okay, I can see these characters existing in a world like this. That same mentality when you're going to the editor side, helping a fellow writer understand this notion for their characters, like, you've created this incredible world. You want your characters to be believable and realistic, that, it makes sense for a character like this to exist in the world you have created, which honestly, you're right. It is, a struggle to make your characters as believable as possible without relying heavily on, stereotypes, cliches, tropes, and more. So from that point, when you began these paths, I should say, as both, writing your own stories as well as building your career as an editor, what was sort of the reaction like from friends and family? And as a tangent on the editor side, what was the reaction like from your first client that you worked with? And how has that impacted you going forward?
For the most part, I have very supportive friends and family. I I did leave a job, and I had one of the bosses at that job basically tell me that he basically came over to my cubicle and was like, "So why are you doing this? You haven't sold your book. This just seems really weird to me. And how are you going to make like asking me all these kind of inappropriate questions?" And I I don't remember exactly how I answered him, but I basically was like, well, this is what I've wanted to do my entire life. I was in medical billing for like 12 years. And nobody grows up and wants to be a medical biller. And that's what I told him. I said, this was not my dream job. This was my job to pay the bills while I was doing editing and writing on the side. And yeah, so overall, very supportive from friends and family. I would say that moving into writing full-time, the biggest thing that I wanted to make sure was that writing still felt fun.
Yes.
Because when it becomes your job, it can feel, especially when you're editing your own work, it can feel like a chore. And I am not saying that it never feels that way by any means. But I think the best way to do that is, honestly, I've found staying connected with like local writers is really helpful, because they're passionate, you're passionate. It builds up that momentum. And I also run a local writing group, and there's a lot of non-professional. There's some professional writers in that group, and there's some non-professional writers in that group. And being around people that are at various stages of their writing, like career and ability, is really helpful, because it reminds you why you love this, which I think is key to making that switch from something that's a side gig, so to speak, to a full-time thing. In terms of my first editing client, I got really good feedback from my first editorial client. It was not a developmental edit. It was a combination of line and copy editing. So it was the very like gritty detail of like, don't spell axe with an E, battle axe should have a hyphen, those types of like that, the details that I like looking for in other people's work, but hate looking for in my work. And so I got a lot of really positive feedback from that. I think that people don't realize how much work editing can be. I think a lot of writers, I think some writers really know how much time editing can take, because buying editorial services, especially as an indie author, can be quite expensive.
Yes.
And I try to walk that line as an editor of not offering my services at a good price so that people can afford it, but also not devaluing my own time and work, because there is a lot of brain power put into reading something very, like, I essentially read an entire manuscript. I read it at least 3 times, and the first time I read it, I'm reading it out loud to myself. So it's a very slow, detail-oriented process. But then it catches a lot of things that you just miss when you're skimming. So if you have an editor, hug them today, because they've done a lot of work.
That's absolutely true. And you hit the nail on the head, Beth, about, being an editor is, it's very, very challenging and difficult, because, there is a lot of processes, because it's not just, oh, you're editing a book. No, there's proofreading, copy editing, line for line. There's so many different steps into the editing process, and also where they are in the service bracket, in the sense of, if an author is coming with a manuscript saying, I just need proofread, then that's just the proofread edit.
Right. And then, versus like developmental edits where you're making substantial changes to the manuscript. And I think a lot of writers are very open to feedback, but there obviously are some people that come into this field and think, oh, I can just write something and put it out there. And I mean, I know of people putting out their first drafts out into the world, which kind of blows my mind. Don't put your first drafts out on Amazon to sell them. But I think people don't realize the complexity of producing a manuscript. And again, that goes back to kind of like the publishing program that I'm in. It's been really good for learning how the indie and the traditional publishing process works front to back. And honestly, I feel like a lot of writers would benefit from more business savvy knowledge, because A, so they don't get taken advantage of, but B, so that they know what they're doing when they walk in the door, and they can tell either they know what they want from an indie standpoint, or they can help represent themselves to a publisher or an agent better.
Absolutely, 100%. And then from, your growth then on, overall, would you say and agree that your goals have been, I don't want to say validated, but your goals as an author and your goals of an editor have been met, and you feel that you're now at a good place to, continue to grow and expand into other avenues for both?
Yes, I would say I would like to sell my manuscript, would probably be my next goal. My other goal for this year for me personally is to finish writing. I'd like to finish writing 4 additional novels, which would put me at 7 novels done.
Congratulations.
I'm not quite sure I'm gonna make that goal. I'm gonna have at least 3 done by the end of the year. And then be done editing the 2 that I finished last year. And I would just like to continue to grow the editorial business. I don't want to take on, it's a balancing act, because I have my own writing that I want to pay attention to and not neglect. And then I also want to do the editorial side as well. And I also am very passionate about helping just authors in general learn the business of writing, not get taken advantage of, especially in the indie sphere, because there is a lot of there's the vanity presses, there's people that offer courses that really they're not going to teach you anything that you couldn't learn for free, or buying a book. There's a whole ecosystem around indie writers that benefits from their money. And I just don't want people to be taken advantage of, essentially.
Absolutely. And you touch on quite a few important topics that we will get to later in the interview, in the business portion, which I think is very important to talk about. Before we get to that, there are a few questions that I would like to hear your thoughts on, your opinions. So the first is a reflective question, which I think is very important to note, which is, as writers, as well as creators in general, whenever we work on a project, whether, of course, we're writers, editors, artists, musicians, whatever, we imprint a little bit of ourselves into our work, especially if it is our first work that we have been working on, because it is a process. It's not a get rich quick scheme. It is years and years of blood, sweat, and tears trying to get a finished product out there. And in today's digital age, it is both a blessing and a curse, a double-edged sword, as I like to call it. On one side, it's if you're an author, you're able to meet with a wide range of fellow like-minded authors who maybe write in the same genre or write similar stories, or even readers who enjoy those types of stories. On the other side of the coin, we do leave ourselves exposed to hate speech, trolls, spam, a lot of negativity, and that can be detrimental to a person's mental health and overall well-being. And of course, imposter syndrome is going to be at the forefront, in the back of our minds, telling us that we're not good enough. No one's going to read our works if we're authors, or no one's going to ask for our services if we are providing a service as editors, or maybe as cover artists, or what have you. And again, that can be very detrimental to a person's overall well-being and confidence. So for you, Beth, when you began this journey of yours, working on your own writing, but also growing your career as an editor, have you ever had those moments of heightened anxiety and imposter syndrome? And if so, or maybe not, what has disciplined you to continue going?
That is a complex question. So, okay, I'm gonna give you the most recent example that I've had. I am querying a novel, and you get rejections, and it is so. It can be really disheartening to just get constantly rejected. And as an editor, I know I've sat on the other side of that desk. I've rejected people myself. I've sent rejection slips. So, especially for anthologies that I've been on, I've rejected people. And so I happen to know, like, the editor side of me knows that rejection isn't necessarily personal. It can mean you sent me a nonfiction piece when I didn't ask for nonfiction, or you sent me something that's really gory and that's not appropriate for this project that I'm working on. Or I'm looking for a bunch of mermaid stories and I got 6 that were very similar and just one stands out, and yours is part of the 5 that didn't really stand out. So it doesn't, just because you get rejected doesn't mean it's personal. It's definitely not personal. And it doesn't necessarily mean that your story is poorly written or poorly executed. It just means it's not the right fit for that project, for that agent, for that editor, for that magazine, for whatever. There's a ton of reasons behind all of that stuff. So I try to keep in mind that it's not personal. That even though it feels very intimate to me as the writer, it's not it isn't meant as a personal rejection. It's not somebody walking up and slapping me in the face and calling me names. It is business.
Yes.
And I think you really have to separate that creative side from that business side.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of like imposter syndrome, I feel like that's just kind of always, I hate to tell you that it's kind of there. It's just lurking. And I kind of try and not listen to it. One of the best ways I found to cope with kind of that self-doubt and then anxiety is to personalize it. So my imposter syndrome, her name is Hilda, and she's a very angry German woman who I don't want to talk to because all she does is yell at me. So I kind of separate it from myself and make it something a little silly, a little less threatening, and I try not to fall into those thought cycles, because all of those self-doubting thought cycles, they don't really accomplish anything for me. And so I try
Right.
to stay focused on, and the other thing is I truly love writing. Like I love writing, I love editing, and those are the things that I have control over. So like I think it's Brandon Sanderson that said something along the lines of like, you can't control the market, you can't control whether people like your work, but all you can control is how much you're writing, that you're getting better at it, and that you're trying to put your work out there. Like those are the things that you have control over, and that's what you need to focus on.
Absolutely, 100%. And again, you're probably like, was it the 15th author I've had on the show that's mentioned Brian Sanderson again? Like, he's like mentioned, I can't tell you how many times I've had that name mentioned on the show, as well as a few others. I think the two other authors you mentioned earlier in the interview, they've also been name dropped like numerous times, which only tells me I need to look these authors up and add their books to my long list of TBRs.
Yeah, if you read a lot of fantasy, you'll know Brandon Sanderson, and then Mercedes Lackey and Robin McKinley. They were a little more big in the 90s, early 2000s. It's been about 10 years since Robin McKinley put anything out. But like if you fell into fantasy anywhere between, like 91 and 2008, you're going to be pretty familiar with those three. So
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely check them out. Thank you for that.
mhm.
And another fun question, which again, I'd like to hear your thoughts on. This actually comes from a guest that I've had on the show not too long ago. Her name is Jasmine Young. And she posted on her socials that we are now in a golden age of independent creators. Because in her view, from her opinion, is that this golden age emerged during the lockdown, the 4 years of isolation.
Mhm.
And in some regards, I do agree. I was one of the authors who emerged during lockdown. I was able to publish or write and get all 3 of my 4 books published during the lockdown period. So I've been asking my guests this question, and I've got a lot of differing responses to this. Some agree that we are in a golden age of independent authors and creators. Others argue that we are not in a golden age per se. Definitely a new age, but not a golden age. Some even go further, saying that the lockdown just sped up this process because it was already on the rise.
Mhm.
And some even go even to the extreme, saying that we are in no golden age and possibly no new age, because while there is an influx of new material, whether that's music, artistry, books, what have you, a majority of them don't have the passionate drive behind them. There was no passion in their creation. They were just simply made just to exist. So, Beth, in your opinion, as both a writer and an editor, do you believe we are in a new age of sorts for independent creators?
I'm going to say yes and no.
Okay.
Because I think the rise of, specifically in indie publishing, we are seeing a lot more people putting out books, which is great. And I think there are a lot of underrepresented voices that are present in the ecosphere of book publishing that were not present 10, 15 years ago.
Absolutely.
Which I think is excellent. And I think that's adding to the breadth and complexity of what we're reading because we're not getting the same perspectives. And I think that's important. However, I do think there's a lot of material out there. Now, on the one hand, there's a lot of people who, like me, read a lot of books. And so they can keep up with all of those rapid releases. And then there's other people that don't read as much, so they're not going to get as much access. So I think in some ways, we are in a golden age in that if you want to write a book and you want to put it out, it doesn't matter how good or terrible it is or what the content is, you can put it out into the world, which is a powerful thing. But then it can tip the market into oversaturation.
Right.
And so I think there is pros and cons to where we are sitting right now. I think, like I said, there's a lot of new voices. There's a lot of more representation. There isn't this gatekeeping aspect to publishing that was there 20 years ago.
Yes.
And I think that's really important because in some ways it gives writers more power. It gives the artists themselves more power. But then we are also in this age where it's harder to stand out. It's harder to sell large quantities of books. It's in some ways it can be harder to make a living as an independent writer, to stand out among all of the other things that are out there. Which is why I think like knowing the business of publishing a book is so important because you need a quality book cover. You need a quality product put out into the world. So I think it has its advantages and disadvantages, but would I want to go back to the old system? No, never, absolutely never. Because I feel like there was too much gatekeeping and too much of one perspective. Like I feel like it was very siloed and we got this perspective over and over and over and over again. And you didn't see the breadth and the depth of kind of the voices that we're hearing from, which I think is really important.
Absolutely. And you know what, Beth, I absolutely agree with everything you said. And even to go one step further to coin another guest I've had on a different show, Bradley, he looked at it from a TV movie perspective where if you look at viewers who are, watching their movies, there's almost like, as he said, no drive for creativity in the sense that it's going to be marketable and you're going to reap the rewards. And that's why you see a lot of studios going to their IPs, doing remakes or just revamping the genre. And as viewers, initially, if it's like the first remake in a long time, I was like, okay, that's fine. But then again, there are so many movies that are remakes of each other. It's like we kind of know the story. Yes, you're doing it in a different style, but we know what's going to happen from A to Z. We know the beat for beat. So why are you even making this? And as he said it further, that there's this hesitancy to make something new because while people will have their critiques about the IPs, they would go and rather see a movie from an IP that they know, as opposed to one that's entirely alien to them. Same thing in the publishing world, where as authors, we unknowingly write the same style of books, whether it's like the hero's journey, enemies to lovers, or villains to heroes, or heroes to villains, what have you. Even though as authors we have our own individuality, the same kind of story is the same. And we don't want to subvert the genre or the expectations too much because, again, as I'm sure you probably have discussed with some of your clients when working on their books together, you don't want to be too new that it just loses the reader's attention.
Well, and I think to your point, we have a more educated consumer.
Yes.
They know what the tropes are. They know, they have expectations. When they read a dark romance, they're looking for certain beats in that. And granted, romance is a very structured genre. And it has some really hard and fast rules that you cannot break. More so than like fantasy or horror. But I think you have readers that know the tropes, the style that they're looking for. And so they want the same thing, but not quite the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a skill in marketing your book that has the elements of those things while making it stand out as different. But the other disadvantage, I think, is that in some ways we're all victims of algorithms. Because I was listening to, I think it was a New York Times podcast like a while ago. They were talking about why people are not producing new movies and TV shows. And they were saying a lot of it has to do with the algorithm. The algorithm sees that you like historical romance, so it gives you 10 different recommendations for that. Or it sees that you like murder mysteries, so it gives you 10 different recommendations like that. But after a while, they all start looking the same.
Yes.
And partially they're designed to do that so that they fall into the algorithm. So you get it recommended. But then the problem is you get this regurgitation effect where everything kind of just feels like bleached out different versions of the same thing. And I feel like the solution to that is complex. I don't really know what, like, I feel like that's a society-wide problem that I'm not sure what we do with that.
Absolutely, 100%. That perfectly segues into, of course, the business portion of the interview, which I'm so excited to hear your thoughts to these questions. So as a little icebreaker, Beth, when you began writing your first novel and your novels thereafter, did you have a good idea of your audience because you knew the genre from a reader's perspective, that you read these stories growing up? So it's like, okay, I enjoy these type of stories. I know this is what they're marketing to, so I'm going to take that into account when I write my own stories. And in turn, do you take that same mentality and use it when working with a client who may be struggling to understand their audience for their books?
I would say when I started my first novel, I knew the genre. And I knew what style of writing I liked. And I knew what kind of story I liked. I can't say that meant that I mean, there are other readers that read the same thing as me.
Right.
But I can't say that I wrote specifically to that audience.
Okay.
I think for me, there is a massive difference between writing the novel and selling the novel. And in between those things is editing.
Right.
Because that first draft is really me telling the story however I want.
Yes.
And it can be as messy and terrible as I want it to be. I let it be as awful as it needs to be just be out there in the world. And then taking it from that to a commercial product is a completely different process. And I think that's where writers get stuck, is they have this oftentimes an amazing, complex, beautiful idea, and they write it, but there's a lack of understanding that you have to take it from this beautiful thing that you love, that you put all this time and effort into something that's a commercial product.
Right.
And you kind of have to, in some ways, you have to find a way to subvert the creative side of you for that step of the process. You have to. That's why that's why I handwrite a lot of my first drafts are all handwritten, because I have to shut off that business editor, how do I make this marketable side of me, and just write. And those are two different skills, and it's hard sometimes to transition between those two things. And it's honestly the only way you're going to make it as a commercial writer is to be willing to change your work. And you don't. And I'm not saying that if you write a dark romance and your editor wants to change it to a modern day sweet Hallmark story that you need to do that. Like, no, you shouldn't let somebody come in and just completely overhaul your story.
Absolutely.
But you need to listen to people when they say, hey, this doesn't make sense, or hey, the pacing here is really slow, or hey, the pacing here is really too fast. And because there is writing as the art and writing as the business, and you have to be able to have a product that's interesting and engaging and that makes sense. Like stuff makes sense to you that doesn't necessarily make sense to your reader. And
Yes.
so that's what the editing process is all about, is making that product something that you can sell, which in some ways I think, there's this high ideal of artistry and writing in general that's like, well, it shouldn't be about the money.
Mm.
And yes, if you just want to write for your own pleasure and not just put things on Substack or just push things out on your own blog, and you don't care how much money you make from it, that is totally fine. You are still a writer. You're still an author. But if you want to make money from it, that's a different ballgame.
Yes, 100%. I also like how you brought up the fact that, editors and, again, an author having to change their story, which I've had a lot of editors talk about this on the show, that is sort of like the hesitancy of independent authors to reach out to editors because they're afraid that the editor is going to say, this story is complete trash. You need to change it completely. And as we talked about before, it's a long time to write a full manuscript. And if we're just starting from scratch, that's even longer. So there is that hesitancy, but as authors, we should be able to give the editor a chance because, there are editors who are, very understanding, who want the book to be successful and they want the author to be successful as well. And this notion of, changing the story can even go as, I don't want to say as simple, but it can even be as more centered as the readership. And what I mean by that, viewers and listeners, is the age range for our books, because you have middle grade, YA, NA, which is new adult, and AF, which is adult fiction. So if you're working with an editor, quite possibly, as an example, you're writing a gothic romance story, and the editor may say, this is good, but I don't think it'll be good for the age group that you're want to market towards. Let's say if it was YA, and instead the editor may say this will be good as new adult or adult fiction, and you can go as mature or as young adult as you want for that story. And I think that's a very important skill to really note. Beth, what are your thoughts on this?
I think that's very important. I only edit for adult stuff. I don't tend to read a lot of young adult, and I don't edit a lot of young adult. And I definitely don't edit for middle grade. So I would not be the person for those books, because you need somebody that specializes in those age ranges.
Yes.
If that's the group that you're aiming towards, that's the group you need to specialize and go towards. That's why, like, on a lot of my stuff, I put that I'm a fantasy and horror editor, because, and I will edit other things. I've edited nonfiction stuff. I can edit other things. It's not like I don't have that skill set, but I know the fantasy and horror genres. I know what those are like, and I can read those things without, somebody that maybe doesn't read horror as an editor isn't going to be as good, because maybe some of the gore is going to bother them. Maybe it's going to be too dark for them. Like, you need somebody that's familiar with that. Just like if you're going to hire a sensitivity reader, you're not going to hire, to go with some stereotypes here, you're not going to hire a straight white guy to be your sensitivity reader about a novel about Black lesbians. Like, that's just not where you're going to go for that. So I think it's the same kind of thing. You need somebody that specializes in those areas and has the expertise that you need. The other thing is just, if you have an editor, kind of going back to your first statement, if you send a manuscript to an editor and they send it back and they say, this is terrible, stop being a writer, they're not a good editor.
Yes.
across the board, they are a terrible editor. They should not be doing it, because they should be giving you, especially if you're paying them, they should be giving you constructive feedback. And it may be, yes, you have to revamp large portions of your book. I'm not saying that that's not a possibility, but they should be giving you constructive feedback about how to make it better and what is good and what is bad, because there is very few works in the world that I would say are without redeeming quality.
That is true. That is very, very true. Now, let's talk about that same mindset, like the readership, but for your works as the author. Now, for you, Beth, would you say genuinely you write for a more adult audience for your stories? But I'm curious, has there ever been a story that you've been passionate about, just the idea, and considered, could this work as, a young adult or a new adult story?
Yes. The novel that I'm querying right now, I actually started off thinking it was going to be a young adult novel.
Okay.
And then it just sort of got darker and darker and darker and darker. And so I knew it was not going to be young adult appropriate for that market. I have contemplated writing some more like young, like picture books, type things. I haven't taken the time to do it. And I'm not opposed to the YA or middle grade genres. I don't read them, and I just don't have the exposure to know what those types of things, like, I have a vague idea of what they're looking for, but I don't have a real solid concept of that.
Absolutely, 100%. And that leads to another thing that I think you brought up too, which is the separation of the editor and the reader, and how we have to have two different mindsets when we're approaching to each of those phases respectfully if we're working on our own stories. So for you, Beth, when you began this journey of yours, how have you been able to separate the two, but still showcase your individuality as both an author who, again, wants to show her work, wants to show her voice, while staying true to the source materials, or at least the types of stories that you grew up with? And same thing for an editor, where you do want to show how you approach editing, but also still staying true and not devaluing or diminishing your own self-worth as a person who's trying to build a business, a career.
So a lot of times I give myself space between drafts. Because when you first write that story, you're in love with it. You think it's the best thing you've ever written, and you just adore every sentence, and to do anything with it would break your heart.
Yes.
I usually give myself like a month to 6 weeks. And in the meantime, I've moved on and worked on other projects that are my new darling and I love, and they're my new, wonderful, sparkly thing. And then I go back to my old drafts and I'm like, oh, this is gross. I hate this. Like, it's terrible. And no, it's not actually terrible. But in my head, I'm like, okay, now I'm ready to hack away at this thing and make the changes that I need to make it better. Because when you're like, I learned this, I took an acrylics painting class like a year ago. And I learned I was like replicating somebody else's painting. And I learned that if I stood there and stared at the painting too long, I got mad at it. And I was like, it's terrible. It's horrible. I hate it. I hate everything about it. And as soon as I felt like that, I would go, okay, I'm going to not look at this painting for 5 seconds. And I would literally turn my back, count to 5, and then turn around and be like, oh, okay, it's not so terrible. And I think the writing process is kind of similar to that, where sometimes when you're too close to it, you can't see all of the bad things about it. But then sometimes when you've been staring at it too long, you only see the bad things about it. And I think as as an editor, my job is not to change an author's voice.
Right.
And that's why I really believe that good editing should be invisible. It should be, you should not be able to tell where the editor did something and where the writer did something. That's bad editing. That's really terrible editing. Because my job is not to rewrite the novel, write it the way that I would do it, change it to my writing style. My job is to help you make your writing the best that it can be by helping you through the technical process of finding all of those details. And truthfully, you need to have other people read your work. And I don't mean your cousin, your mother. I mean writing group, writing friends, editors, beta readers, because you need people to read your work and give you feedback on it, because it can be hard to see the holes in your own writing, and see where things don't make sense and where you need to add explanations or scenes or things like that.
Absolutely. And from writing groups, I also think it's important to note that for indie authors especially, networking is a must, whether that's having a street team, an art team, an editor, maybe quite a few editors so you can get different perspectives, cover artists to do your books, and if you can afford it, a narrator to do the narrations for your book you want to make into an audiobook format. Networking is huge, and I definitely think that doesn't get taught a lot as much when we see, like, seminars or like writers conferences of, like, networking and building a team. Because for me, in my opinion, whenever we hear that notion of like building a team, we only think of the readers, the ARC readers, of people who are going to read the book, but we don't think of, like, especially for indie authors, the people behind the scenes who help make the book what it is. So, Beth, in your opinion, how important is it for indie authors to really understand that, networking is essential? And also, are there any people you would like to give a personal shout out to who have helped you along the way as both an author and an editor?
So, networking is very important. This business is a kind of about who you know. And a lot of businesses are that way. Most businesses are that way, if we're being entirely honest. And even like going and getting a medical appointment, you're going to ask your doctor for a referral. You're going to go to your friends and say, if you're looking for a good surgeon, you're going to ask your friends and say, hey, who do you know that's been a good surgeon? You're going to maybe ask other doctors. You're going to ask your doctor for that referral for that person. And that is a form of networking. And so writing is the same way, because it gives you a lot of connection. It also gives you opportunities to, like, I would say in networking, you need to realize that, especially at conferences, yes, in some ways you're there to sell your product, but that shouldn't be the goal of the interactions that you're having, because people will recognize that disingenuousness. But like at the most recent conference that I was at, I was just walking around talking to people, and I pitched my novel to like 2 or 3 different people that just asked me about it because I was talking to them about it. And we were talking about books. Like, I was talking to a publisher and telling her that I absolutely loved their covers. And we were talking about that and a couple other things. And then she asked me about my novel. So you don't know when those opportunities are going to come up. But also don't force them. I would caution against that. And the thing about the writing community, at least there are pockets of it that can be unsupportive.
Yes.
I would steer away from those. Because the authors that I have met, the vast majority of them, it's not a competition. You having success does not deter from mine. My success does not deter from yours. And so I think you need to make sure that you're in a supportive writing community that wants to build all writers up, and isn't like, oh, well, if you're indie published, then you're not a real writer. Like, that attitude I don't see that attitude as much as I did like 10 or 15 years ago, but it's still there in some pockets of the writing community. So steer away from people who aren't supportive, who are dismissive of certain types of writers. If they're dismissive of romance writers or YA writers or children's authors or things like that, those are not people that you want to be around. Because we need to be supportive of all writers, of all types of writers, no matter how they're published. And like you said, it gives you a network to build. So like it helps you sell your book. It helps you talk to other editors. It helps you meet people. And we all need support in this process because we're all sitting alone in a coffee shop writing, and you need the support of other writers, and you need the information that they all have, because you can't keep track of the market all on your own. And so it's really good to have other writers that you can talk to them about their advertising experience, talk to them about, and it's also a good way to know who you don't want to do business with, who is an editor who is actually a scam artist. What's, like Writer Beware is a great resource for making sure you're not running into a vanity publisher or an editor or a writing competition that's really a scam. Like we talked about earlier, there's all kinds of those things that float around. And so in networking, you kind of safeguard yourself against some of those more predatory people.
Yes, and thank you for bringing up Writers Beware, because I learned about that the first time at a writers conference, and it is huge. And for those who are just learning about this right now, if you're an author, definitely research that and definitely have that bookmark, because it is huge. That could be about not just content, that could be publishers, that could be editors, that could be artists, that could be anyone that, as authors, we all collectively formed this community. And I believe the person who told about this the first time at the conference, she learned about it through a mutual friend. And it was from that website that it can cross-reference, like, okay, I'm working with this person. Are they up on this website? Oh, they are. Let me research them. Oh, okay. So they've done this, this, this. That is huge. So that's definitely a huge resource to have. So before we get to the final question, Beth, are there any people you would like to give a personal thank you, a shout out to, who have helped you along the way in your career?
Well, so I would love to thank Kevin G. Anderson is the head of my writing program at Western. So I'd love to give him a shout out. Allison, hold on just a second, because I cannot remember her last name. I have people's first names memorized, but not their last names memorized.
Same.
Just give me one moment. So the other person that runs my program is Allison Longeria. She's an editor. I'd love to give her a shout out. And one of the clients that I'm working with very closely right now, her name is Megan Friedman. She's running Quills and Cosmos. They are a small press. And she's really helped my editorial business. She's been wonderful to work with. And also a shout out to my writing group. There's like 5 or 6 people in that, so I'm not going to name them individually. And then I've got a bunch of writing friends, Megan, Jen, they're all wonderful. And then also just my local writing open mic night. It's run by a wonderful woman named Jacqueline at my local arts community center. And I'd love to give her a shout out because she teaches writing classes. That's the other thing is, if you've got a community arts center that teaches writing classes, I don't care how many books you've published, take a writing class.
Yes, absolutely.
Because it will help you with your craft, because you can always get better. And it will help remind you why you like writing. Like, that's part of the reason why I'm actually taking a class there later this month. And I love the open mic night. It's so much fun.
Absolutely, 100%, Beth. Now we arrived at the final question. This one's a very loaded question, so I'll give some context to this.
Okay.
So, I've been doing this show now for about 6, 7 years. I've had the opportunity to meet a wide range of authors from indie, hybrid, traditional, and you break that down even further. I've had aspiring authors, debuting authors, um, first timers, uh, authors who have been in the business for about 20 years or so, comic writers, artists who are also authors. I have had an incredible time meeting all these wonderful people, and I've learned a lot from them. And I come to realize that as authors or as independent creators in general, there are two paths that are presented to us. And for authors, it's to be an author and to be known as an author, which are two very different things. To be
Mm,
an author is an individual dedicated to storytelling, the craft. To be known as an author is an individual dedicated to the business side, the marketing aspect. And each has its own set of obstacles and hurdles along the way, but they reach the same goal, which is world renowned success, literacy acclaimed, what have you. However, as we talked about throughout this interview, and maybe we touched on it a little bit, if you're going into this industry, you have to understand that as authors, this is not a get rich quick industry. It's not
mm-mm.
an industry you can make money just like that. And your goals have to be realistic because, and I'm sure you probably have talked about this with your clients, Beth, or maybe you've learned this in your classes, is that in this industry, it's a 50-50 chance, or maybe not even 50-50, that your book's going to be a success, whether that's a commercial success or the start of your legacy. But with that said, there are a few exceptions to the rule. There are many authors throughout history whose first works did launch their career. All the power to them. That is not an easy thing to do from the get go, especially if it's your first book or your first series of books. However, generally speaking, it's not going to be automatic. You will have to work for it. It is a grind, but it is obtainable. So, Beth, here is the final question. With everything you have learned in your career as both an author and an editor, how would you help a fellow author really understand this notion that, yes, there is no guarantee in this industry your book is going to be a commercial success, but that shouldn't stop you from honing your craft. If you're truly passionate about this industry and you understand your goals in the sense that they need to be realistic, your word of wisdom, so to speak.
I would say you need to really think about what you want. If you want, like we said before, if you're not necessarily worried about making money, you want to put your books out on Substack or, do fan fiction writing or
Hmm.
um just publish things on a blog, a website. I mean, anybody can have a website at this point. Like, it's not that hard. If you just want to put your work out into the world, or even just like, you can literally write an ebook, upload it to Amazon, and put it as an ebook. Anybody can do that. And it could
Yeah.
be gobbledygook. It doesn't even have to make sense, quite honestly. So if your goal is just to put a work out into the world, you can do that. There are ways to do that. If your goal is to have this as a viable business, that is something different. And you have
Mm.
to approach it with a different set of goals. And not You have to have a realistic view of the market. You have to have a realistic view of your genre within that market. Uh,
Yes.
and also, depending on whether you're going to be trad or indie, that will also change for your genre and
Yeah.
will change your access to the market. Or if you do like a small press or a hybrid publisher of some sort.
Mm.
Um, and so I think you really need to think about what your individual goals are and kind of decide from there. Um, and also understand what you can and cannot control.
Hmm.
You cannot control the market. You cannot control how successful your book is. You cannot make people read it. You cannot make people like it. And I can guarantee you there's going to be somebody out there that hates your book. You cannot control those things. What you can do is make sure that you write the best book that you can, hire quality people to edit it, do the cover design for you if you can afford it. There are ways of doing cover design that you don't necessarily have to put a lot of money into. And there are a lot of freelance editors out there. Actually, a great resource for that is the Editorial Freelance Association, the EFA. Ooh. They have a list of rates, and they will rate what's an appropriate range for editing services based on what you're asking for. So it's X amount of cents per word for proofreading for fiction. And they'll give you a range, and that'll tell you how unreasonable, like if your editor is asking you for $10,000 for a manuscript, that's way too much money.
Yeah, that's way too much.
I would say for most, if you need like copy and line editing, you're gonna, for like 100,000 word manuscript, you're gonna spend $2,000 to $3,000. It just depends on the type of editing you're looking for, but they break that all down. So that would be a good way to find, and that's all. And I'm a part of that organization. They're a good way of finding reputable editors. Readsy is also a really good resource for finding editors and cover artists and layout people. Though personally, I think layout is not, it can get complicated, but it's not super complicated if you can take the time to learn it. I'm getting into the weeds here with my answer, but I think you just need to be aware of what you can and can, and if you can put, your goal should be to put a quality book out into the world. Best writing, best editing, best cover design, whether you're doing that yourself or you're selling your manuscript and they're doing it for you, you want to be working with people that are going to help you put the best manuscript that you can out into the world. And then you are going to have to market.
Yes.
I know writers don't like that, but you're going to have to market. You're going to have to be online, but don't be online just selling your book. A lot of my online content is not about my book. It's about, I went on a hike today. Here's a terrible writing prompt. Here's a terrible writing advice. It's a bunch of different things.
Right.
So put content out there that's authentic to you, that you feel comfortable putting out into the world. And then try and bring in a following and sell your book that way. Ads are a big thing. Newsletters. There's a whole bunch of marketing. Work with your local library. Get to know your local Writers Association. So for me in Colorado, I'm part of the Pikes Peak Writers Association. That's the local writing kind of thing. There's also like state guilds and international guilds. There's the Writers Guild, all of that stuff. So I think putting a good quality, like that's what you can do. You can control the quality of your product and how you market it. And then everything else is kind of up to chance, and you do with that what you will. And I would say don't make your sales your goal. That is not something you control. Make putting quality writing and a quality product your goal.
That is beautifully said, Beth, and a perfect way to end the first author interview for the month of May, and also first editor interview for the month of May, I might add. So with that, I just jumbled up there. With that said, everybody, thank you all so much for joining us for an amazing episode here on the channel. I want to give a huge thank you to Beth for coming on the show and telling us all about her work as an author, as well as her services as an editor. And speaking of which, Beth, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out to you and if they want to inquire about your services as an editor?
So I have, like I said, I have an editing site, I have a writing site. So I am on TikTok under Beth.Carlberg. I'm on Instagram under, I think it's under Beth.Carlberg. I'm then also on both of those places under Iler, ILER.editing. I have a website for both of those that also have my social media links. My writing website is bethcarlberg.net, and my editing website is ilerediting.net. That editing website has my email, it has my rates, it has reviews. I don't have my, what's the word I'm looking for? The thing where I give editing samples.
Like a portfolio kind of
Yes,
thing?
thank you. I was like, what is that word? The only word I could think of was limelight, which is not the right word at all. So I don't have my portfolio on there, but I have that and my resume for people who are seeking me as clients. I just don't put it on my website, but I have all of that available. On my writing website, I have some short stories that people can read. I've got my email, I've got my bio. I'm mostly on Instagram and TikTok. I post videos about writing, my books, my life, projects that I'm working on, all of that stuff on both of those places.
Awesome. I will link all those down below in the description of this video. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the first ever interview here for the month of May. Again, a huge thank you to Beth for making her official debut here on the show. We wish her the very best on her journey as an author with her books coming out soon, as well as her journey as an editor. We wish her and her business great success. And if you are an author in need of services, remember, all those social media links will be down below. So definitely reach out to Beth to inquire about her services. And until next time, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember, as always, there's the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. Signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you all in the next episode.